What would you do if you discovered that your moment of cruelty had destroyed the life of someone who was already fighting battles you couldn't imagine? The story you're about to hear will show you how one wealthy man's heartless decision came back to teach him the most important lesson of his life, and why sometimes our greatest mistakes become our most powerful teachers. Richard Sterling owned half the restaurants in downtown Chicago. At 55, he'd built an empire from nothing, climbing from poverty to penthouse through sheer determination and ruthless business decisions. His net worth had more zeros than most people could count. His suits cost more than average families spend on groceries in a month, and his reputation for being tough but fair had made him a legend in the restaurant industry. But success had changed Richard in ways he didn't recognize. The man who once understood struggle had forgotten what it felt like to choose between paying rent and buying medicine. Wealth had built walls around his heart, and compassion had become a luxury he believed he couldn't afford. On this busy Friday evening at Sterling's flagship restaurant, the Golden Crown, Richard was conducting one of his surprise inspections. He moved through the dining room like a hawk, watching every server, timing every order, calculating every dollar of profit with the precision that had made him rich. That's when he noticed her. 24-year-old Maria Gonzalez was 6 months pregnant and struggling to keep up with the dinner rush. She'd been working at the Golden Crown for 8 months, and until recently, she'd been one of their best servers. Customers loved her warm smile, her attention to detail, and her genuine care for their dining experience. But tonight, Maria was different. She moved more slowly, took longer breaks, and Richard's eagle eyes caught every perceived mistake. Table 12 is still waiting for their appetizers. Richard snapped at Maria as she passed by carrying a tray of drinks. And Table 15 asked for extra bread 20 minutes ago. Maria's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling. I'll take care of that right away." She hurried toward the kitchen, but Richard wasn't finished. He followed her, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the tile floor like a countdown to disaster. "Miss Gonzalez," Richard called out coldly. "My office." Now, what happened next would haunt Richard Sterling for the rest of his life. In his plush office overlooking the city, Richard sat behind his massive mahogany desk while Maria stood uncomfortably, her hand instinctively resting on her growing belly. "Maria, your performance has been declining for weeks," Richard began without any warmth. "You're slow, you're making mistakes, and frankly, you're not the server you used to be." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Mr. Sterling, I know I've been struggling lately, but I can explain." "I don't want explanations," Richard interrupted harshly. "I want results. This restaurant has a reputation to maintain, and I can't have servers who can't keep up with the demands of the job." He leaned back in his leather chair, completely oblivious to the desperation in Maria's eyes. "I'm letting you go, effective immediately. You can collect your final paycheck from accounting." Maria's world collapsed in that moment. "Please, Mr. Sterling, I need this job. I'm pregnant, and I don't have anywhere else to turn. I could do better, I promise." But Richard's heart had turned to stone. "That's not my problem, Maria. Business is business. Your pregnancy doesn't excuse poor performance." The cruelty of his words hit Maria like physical blows. She stood there for a moment, processing the reality that she just lost the only income she had with a baby on the way. "Understand," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for the opportunity." She turned and walked out of his office with whatever dignity she had left, while Richard was already moving on to his next business decision. He had no idea that he'd just destroyed the life of someone who was fighting battles he couldn't imagine. But the universe has a way of teaching lessons to those who need them most. What Richard didn't know about Maria Gonzalez would have broken the heart of any decent human being. Maria was completely alone in the world. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving her with no family and crushing medical debt from their final hospital stays. She'd moved to Chicago with nothing but hope and determination, working multiple jobs to survive. The father of her baby had abandoned her the moment she told him she was pregnant, leaving her to face the scariest time of her life completely alone. She'd been living in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat, working at the Golden Crown during the day and cleaning office buildings at night. But even that wasn't enough. Maria's pregnancy had been complicated from the start. She suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted all day, making it nearly impossible to eat or keep food down. Her doctor had ordered expensive prenatal vitamins and frequent checkups that her minimum wage salary could barely cover. The reason Maria had been struggling at work wasn't laziness or incompetence. She was battling constant nausea, exhaustion, and the fear that she wouldn't be able to provide for her unborn child. Every slow moment, every mistake Richard had noticed was the result of a young woman pushing herself beyond her physical limits because she had no other choice. And now, with 6 months left in her pregnancy and no income, Maria faced an impossible future. The night after Richard fired her, Maria sat in her cramped apartment with eviction notices scattered across her tiny kitchen table. Rent was due in 3 days, and she had exactly $47 to her name. The baby kicked inside her belly as if sensing her distress. "I'm so sorry, little one," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face as she rubbed her stomach. "Mommy doesn't know how we're going to make it." She spent the weekend applying for jobs, but no restaurant wanted to hire a visibly pregnant woman who would need maternity leave in 3 months. Retail stores gave her sympathetic looks, but no offers. Even fast food places turned her away. By Monday morning, Maria was desperate enough to swallow her pride and do something she'd never done before. But what happened next would change everything. Maria walked back into the Golden Crown during the lunch rush, her head held high despite her desperation. She approached Richard, who was reviewing inventory reports at the bar. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you." Richard looked up with annoyance. "Maria, you don't work here anymore. What could you possibly need to discuss?" "I want to ask you to reconsider," Maria said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know I made mistakes, but I was hoping you might give me another chance." Richard's expression hardened. "I already told you, business is business. Your personal situation doesn't change the fact that you couldn't do the job." "I understand your position," Maria continued, "but I need you to know why I was struggling. I wasn't trying to be a bad employee. I'm 6 months pregnant, completely alone, and I'm facing some health complications that make it hard to—" "Stop right there." Richard cut her off coldly. "I don't want to hear your sob story. Every employee who gets fired has some excuse about why they couldn't perform. Your pregnancy is your problem, not mine." The restaurant fell silent. Other employees stopped what they were doing, shocked by their boss's cruelty. Customers at nearby tables turned to stare. "Please," Maria whispered, her composure finally cracking. "I have nowhere else to go. No family. No savings. No one to help me. This job was all I had." Richard stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Security," he called out. "Escort this woman out of my restaurant, and make sure she doesn't come back." As security approached, Maria looked around the restaurant one last time. She saw the faces of her former co-workers, the customers she'd served with a smile, the place where she'd tried so hard to build a future for herself and her baby. "I hope you never find yourself in my situation," she said to Richard, her voice carrying a dignity that his wealth could never buy. "Because if you do, I hope someone shows you more kindness than you've shown me." Then she walked out into the Chicago winter, 6 months pregnant, unemployed, and completely alone. What Richard didn't know was that his moment of cruelty had been witnessed by someone very important. At table 7, a well-dressed older gentleman had watched the entire exchange with growing horror. Dr. James Mitchell was the chief of obstetrics at Chicago Memorial Hospital, and he was dining with his wife after a long day of delivering babies and saving lives. "Did you see that?" Dr. Mitchell whispered to his wife. "That poor girl is 6 months pregnant, and he just threw her out like garbage." Mrs. Mitchell, who had volunteered with pregnant women in crisis for over 20 years, was already reaching for her purse. "James, we have to help her." They paid their bill quickly and rushed outside, catching up with Maria as she sat on a bus bench, crying in her hands. "Excuse me," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my wife and I witnessed what just happened in there. Are you all right?" Maria looked up, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. I'm fine, she lied. Thank you for asking. No, you're not fine, Mrs. Mitchell said with motherly authority. And that's okay. What that man did and there was unconscionable. But sometimes when terrible things happen, it's because something better is waiting for us. What happened next would restore Maria's faith in humanity. Dr. Mitchell introduced himself and explained that he specialized in high-risk pregnancies. When he learned about Maria's complications and her inability to afford proper prenatal care, he immediately offered to take over her medical care at no charge. But that's not all, Mrs. Mitchell added. My sister owns a beautiful bed and breakfast outside the city. She's been looking for someone to help manage the front desk and assist with guests. The position comes with a small apartment above the inn, full health benefits, and she specifically wants to hire someone who could use a fresh start. Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Because everyone deserves compassion, Dr. Mitchell said simply. And because that baby you're carrying deserves a mother who feels supported and cared for. Within a week, Maria had moved to the peaceful countryside inn, where she was welcomed like family. The work was light, the environment was nurturing, and for the first time in months, she felt hope for her future. But the story was far from over. 3 months later, Dr. Mitchell called with news that would shock everyone involved. Maria had given birth to a healthy baby girl, whom she named Hope. But during the delivery, complications had arisen that could have been fatal without expert medical intervention. Maria, Dr. Mitchell explained, if you hadn't received proper prenatal care these past few months, both you and your daughter could have died during childbirth. That man firing you literally saved your life by forcing you into our path. But the universe still had one more lesson to teach Richard Sterling. 6 months after firing Maria, Richard's restaurant empire began crumbling. A series of bad investments, combined with his reputation for treating employees poorly, led to mass resignations and declining business. The final blow came when a local news station ran a story about workplace discrimination, featuring several former employees who shared stories of Richard's callous treatment. The story went viral, and the Golden Crown became known as the restaurant where pregnant women got fired for being human. Business plummeted. Partners pulled out. Banks called in loans. Within a year, Richard Sterling lost everything he'd spent decades building. At 66, broke and alone, Richard found himself applying for jobs at restaurants he used to compete with. But his reputation preceded him, and no one wanted to hire the man who'd become a symbol of heartless corporate greed. Finally, desperate and humbled, Richard took a job as a dishwasher at a small diner outside the city. It was there, washing dishes and scraping plates, that he finally understood what it meant to struggle for survival. And it was there that he encountered someone from his past. One busy Saturday morning, Richard looked up from the dish pit to see a familiar face at the counter. Maria Gonzalez stood there with a beautiful baby girl in her arms, both of them glowing with health and happiness. Richard's heart stopped. The woman he destroyed was standing just feet away, and she looked more radiant than he'd ever seen her. Maria's eyes met his, and for a moment, time stood still. Then, to Richard's amazement, she smiled. "Hello, Richard," she said gently. "I heard you were working here." Richard couldn't speak. Shame, regret, and disbelief choked off his words. "This is my daughter, Hope," Maria continued, adjusting the baby in her arms. "She's 6 months old now." "Maria," Richard finally managed to whisper, I'm so sorry. What I did to you was unforgivable." "You're right," Maria said calmly. "It was unforgivable, but I've forgiven you anyway." She sat down at the counter, settling Hope in her high chair. "You know, losing that job was the worst thing that happened to me at the time, but it led me to the best things in my life. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst disasters." Richard stared at her in wonder. "How can you be so kind to me after what I did?" "Because holding on to anger would only hurt me and my daughter," Maria replied. "I learned that everyone is fighting battles we can't see. Even you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I manage a beautiful inn now, and we're looking for someone to help with maintenance and groundskeeping. The pay is fair. There's a small cabin on the property for housing, and most importantly, everyone there believes in second chances." Richard took the card with trembling hands. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone helped me when I needed it most," Maria said. "And because Hope deserves to grow up in a world where people choose kindness over cruelty, forgiveness over revenge." She stood up, gathering her daughter and her things. "The job is yours if you want it, Richard. But only if you're ready to become the man you were meant to be, not the man that money made you." As Maria walked away, Richard watched through the window as she strapped her beautiful daughter into a car seat. Hope looked back through the glass and waved her tiny hand, as if blessing the broken man who had once tried to destroy her mother's life. 2 weeks later, Richard Sterling started over at the peaceful countryside inn. He tended gardens, fixed broken shutters, and slowly learned what it meant to find joy in simple, honest work. Maria became not just his employer, but his teacher. She showed him how to measure success, not in dollars, but in dignity, not in what he could take, but in what he could give. 5 years later, Richard had become the grandfather figure that Hope never had. He taught her to plant flowers, told her stories about overcoming mistakes, and showed her that people could change if they truly wanted to. At Hope's 5th birthday party, surrounded by the warmth of the inn's chosen family, Richard stood to make a toast. "5 years ago, I was the richest man I knew and the poorest human being," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. I treated people like numbers on a balance sheet instead of souls with stories." He looked at Maria, who was holding Hope on her lap. "Maria, you taught me that true wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. That real success isn't climbing over others, but lifting them up. That the most valuable currency in the world is compassion." Hope clapped her hands and giggled, and Richard felt his heart fill with a richness no bank account could ever provide. "I lost everything I thought mattered," he continued, "and found everything that actually does. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." Here's what this story teaches us about life. Sometimes our cruelest moments become doorways to our greatest lessons, and sometimes the people we hurt the most become our most important teachers. Richard Sterling thought that firing Maria was just business, but it was actually the beginning of his education in what it means to be human. Maria could have held onto her anger forever, but she chose to transform her pain into purpose, her suffering into strength. Every day, you encounter people who are fighting battles you can't see. The slow cashier might be working through grief. The distracted coworker might be facing family crisis. The struggling employee might be choosing between medicine and meals. You have the power to be Richard at the beginning of this story or Richard at the end. You can choose to see people as obstacles to your success or as fellow human beings deserving of compassion. You can build your wealth by stepping on others or by lifting them up. Maria Gonzalez shows us that grace isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the universe. Forgiveness doesn't excuse cruelty. It transforms it into wisdom. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone who has wronged us is the chance to become better. Remember that your words and actions ripple out into the world in ways you may never know. Richard's cruelty could have destroyed Maria and Hope. Instead, it led them to safety, love, and a beautiful life. His eventual humility and transformation created a grandfather for Hope and a second chance at meaning for himself. The next time you have the power to make someone's day better or worse, remember Hope's tiny wave through the car window. Remember that somewhere, there's a child whose future depends on the kindness or cruelty you choose to show their parent today. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to build better lives for the ones we love. Some of us have more resources, some have more struggles, but we all need the same things: dignity, compassion, and a belief that tomorrow can be better than today. Maria lost a job, but found a family. Richard lost a fortune, but found his soul. Hope gained a grandfather who learned that love is the only wealth that matters. What will you choose when life gives you the power to break someone down or build them up?